You guys know what this represents?
Tell us, sir.
I don't know, maybe it's the calm before the storm.
What's the storm?
Could be the calm before the storm.
What storm is
We have the world's great military people in this room, I will tell you that.
That, of course, was President Trump scaring the bejesus out of a whole lot of Americans, meeting with his national security team and seeming to threaten military action against, well, someone. Just yet another example of something that would be out of bounds for any other president in our history, but somehow it is on par for course for this 45th president. And that's just part of the new normal where Trump is concerned. Slow and insulting responses to Puerto Rico, stirring anger and fear after Charlottesville, being called a moron reportedly by his own Secretary of State, and the list, well, as you know, it goes on and on and on. Now, try to compare your image of President Trump to that of his predecessor, Barack Obama. Now, whether you liked his policies or not, it's impossible to argue that Obama was not more respectful or presidential, let alone even respected. Now, the numbers, they certainly back up that assertion. In a poll taken in June, 63% of Americans said they viewed President Obama favorably, and more than half of all Americans say they wish Obama was still president. Now, try to compare that to the 37.8% approval rating for our current president, with a whole lot of polls showing Trump's approval numbers even lower than that. Well, our next guest has covered both presidents as a White House correspondent for the New York Times, and he's also got a book out focusing on the 44th president. It's called Obama, The Call of History, billed as an authoritative history of the Obama presidency and the first complete account of his time in office that will stand the test of time. Peter Baker, thank you very much for a few minutes. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
We'll talk about timing. When you look at the legacy of President Obama, it took a beating today, both in terms of the Iran nuclear deal and, more significantly, we've learned the last couple of days as it relates to Obamacare. In that regard here, how much of his legacy is being undone before our eyes?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think for a lot of presidents, we assume their legacy is basically done the day they leave office. For President Obama, it's a week-to-week thing at this point. We have a president in the White House right now, President Trump, who is determined not just to take the country in a different direction than his predecessor, but to actually specifically kind of take a sledgehammer to the things that made up his predecessor's legacy. Today, we saw it, obviously, in terms of the Iran deal. We saw it in the last 24 hours in terms of the health care program, where he signed an executive order and refused to make payments on these insurance subsidies. And so you see every day basically sort of a shifting idea of what will be left behind from President Obama's administration. And I think it's going to take a year or two or maybe more just to have a full sense of that.
You know, in the contrast, and you write about in your book, from the approach and the hopes of President Obama and what we saw really from the inauguration address and the last 10 months of this president, two completely different worldviews and two different ideas in terms of whether there was a possible or even a want to unite the country versus intentionally trying to divide. How much in the 8 years did Obama come to the realization that those hopes of unity, of bridging divides, stopping the polarization, was just that, a hope and an impossible reality?
Yeah, that's a great question. He came to our national consciousness in large part in 2004 with a keynote address at the Democratic Convention where he said that there isn't a red America and a blue America. There's the United States of America. And that's an aspiration that he expressed when he became president. But that the reality became much tougher. In fact, the divide we have today is so deep and so profound that not only was he not able to bridge that divide, he said in his final State of the Union that it was his one real regret that he had, in fact, not fixed Washington. He had not been able to reach across the aisle and find ways of working together. We now have a president who doesn't take the same approach. President Trump doesn't actually speak the language of unity. He doesn't talk about the idea of bringing people together that much. It's not something that's his modus operandi. In fact, he enjoys a good fight. His idea is to take on the system, drain the swamp, to use his phrase, and his supporters love when he gets on Twitter and sort of takes on the establishment, starts a fight with the NFL or what have you. So he practices a very different kind of politics.
You know, whether people are the biggest detractors or supporters of him, everyone will agree you don't really have to guess where Trump stands or where he personally feels on something. Just follow the Twitter account. But you wrote that in covering President Obama, you know, at the end he was still an enigma to you, and he was far more closed than even predecessors before him, and certainly his successor.
No, I think that's right. One of the real interesting things about the Obama presidency is this idea of who is Barack Obama anyway. And it's a question he himself addressed. You know, his first book was called Dreams of My Father. It was really a journey of self-discovery. Who am I? How do I fit in? And that's been true politically as well as personally. He is a reserved individual. We as reporters, I think, didn't necessarily get a look inside very much. He didn't want you to see inside. He held back a lot on what he really thought. Whereas President Trump doesn't hold anything back. There's no filter. What he says, what he thinks is what he says. And in fact, through his Twitter feed, I think we do have this remarkable window into the mindset of a president.
There's also some great photographs. And one of the ones is a 5-year-old boy from Philadelphia who asks, and the president bends down and he touches his hair. And obviously the direct connection that, wow, he not only looks like me, but also he's got hair just like me too, the president. You compare that to the racial escalation, and people thought it was amped up in the 8 years of the Obama years, but now obviously with what we saw, not just the NFL, but before that with Charlottesville and a lot of other rhetoric in between. How much, or when do you think we'll know, in terms of history, how much race was a constant overlay in the Obama years? And do you think also in some regards, if he got to do it again, he would have actually spoken out more on race than he actually did?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Look, he knows, of course, that the first line in his obituary, the first line in his history book is going to be the first African-American president. It's just too important in the history of a country that has struggled with race for so long for that not to be, you know, a singular aspect of his election and presidency. But he didn't want that to be the sole defining thing about his presidency. He wanted to be the first African-American president, but he wanted to be a president who actually accomplished important things, whether it be healthcare, whether it be fixing the economy, whether it be climate change, immigration. And so he did resist, I think, being pigeonholed. And at the same time, the polls show that the American attitudes toward race, unfortunately, in fact, did worsen during his presidency, that the numbers changed drastically in terms of people's feelings about the optimistic future of race relations in this country. Again, maybe partly that expectation thing you talked about. We had these great expectations that if we can elect an African-American president, we must be past some of that racial baggage that we've had. That was overly optimistic, obviously. And today we're in a very, very racially charged moment with, as you say, a president who said what he said after Charlottesville and has made this big fight with the NFL that, whether he wants to or not, is certainly being seen in racial terms.
Finally, we showed some poll numbers coming into the segment, Peter, of what people's opinions are of this president and of President Obama. And clearly, you know, there is an affection for him and a plurality in this country. He's been relatively quiet in the last 10 months, given so many headlines that you would think would scream for a reaction. To that end, how much longer do you think he'll bite his tongue, especially given what we talked about at the beginning of this interview, so many of his signature issues being undone seemingly by the day? And also, what do you think his next act will be?
I think you're right. He wants to be quiet. One thing he respected, I think, the way George W. Bush handled his exit from office, that he did not want to create any trouble for his successor, being President Obama, and I think he respected the sort of gracious way President Bush handled that. He wanted to do that himself. Having said that, he also understands, as a matter of politics, that if he is too outspoken in talking about some of these issues, that he would make himself a convenient target for President Trump. President Trump likes to have an enemy to play off of. He likes to have a foil. He likes to have somebody to attack. And if President Obama were the public face of some of these issues right now, it would be a convenient thing for President Trump to make that the issue. Trump versus Obama. He might like that. It would generate some energy with his base at the very least. So President Obama doesn't want to do that. He doesn't want to turn the debate into a debate about him, but he wants to keep it on the issues that he cares about. Having said that, you're right. I think a lot of his supporters are anxious for him to get out in the arena some more. He might do that. He's got a book to write we'll see what the next year or two brings. But he's starting his foundation. He's got some programs already underway, and I think he's got a lot of time left. He's a young man, and I think he wants to still make a mark on the world. So we're going to see how he adjusts. The first year after the White House is a difficult one for almost any ex-president. They're trying to find their footing again after the extraordinary experience that they've had, and it takes a little while till they sort of carve out their next chapter.
Well, talking about a book, the book Obama, The Call of History. And again, we're joined by the author, New York Times Chief White House Correspondent Peter Baker. Peter, I appreciate it, and thanks a lot, and good luck again with the book.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Good talking to you.
Coming up next, after years of worry and alarms from environmental groups, the Indian Point nuclear power plant is scheduled to close for good in about 4 years. But a major environmental worry could outlive the plant and everyone who lives near it. What do you do with the still radioactive fuel rods at the plant that they use to generate power with? Well, it turns out there's no good solution in place. We're going to investigate with our partners at the Journal News. That's straight ahead.